This is the Codicils from chapter 17 by Jane Roberts. So in the book, in chapter 16, Jane's writing, and this is a great story. You guys seriously have to read this book. After you've read all of the Seth books, seriously, this is just so great. One of the characters in the book is talking about the Codicils, and he says that the Codicils taught man about his own potentials and abilities. The resentments and hatreds that had caused individual crimes no longer existed in the same way. Not that men were saints, but they were at least acting like members of a dignified species. They respected themselves and others. A dream archaeologist in the book is describing a dream, and this is what she says, and it's again about the Codicils. She says, "I'll tell you the second one in sequence, though it's somewhat complicated. This dream was almost like a nightmare. In a terribly vivid series of events, I saw what the world would look like now if we didn't have the Codicils. It really was somewhat frightening, but I kept my head and my critical function throughout. Most of the ideas were sheer insanity. It was hard to understand, but in the dream, wars were considered a method of achieving peace. I mean, countries had armies, and the greater the war machines, the greater the chances of peace were considered to be. Idiocy, I told you. And in the dream, mankind hadn't learned how to handle technology at all. Somehow, it was used to build up a country's arsenal of possible retaliatory equipment. The entire affair was most distasteful, and I was really amazed to find myself encountering such nonsense so directly. Some of the people in this book are considered future personalities, and that just happened to be one, and they have the Codicils in their lives, which they treasure. So, here's the Codicils. This is what it says. 1. All of creation is sacred and alive, each part connected to each other part, and each communicating in a creative cooperative commerce in which the smallest and the largest are equally involved. 2. The physical senses present one unique version of reality, in which being is perceived in a particular dimensionalized sequence, built up through neurological patterning, and is the result of one kind of neurological focus. There are alternate neurological routes, biologically acceptable, and other sequences so far not chosen. 3. Our individual self-government and our political organizations are byproducts of sequential perception, and our exterior methods of communication set up patterns that correlate with and duplicate our synaptic behavior. We lock ourselves into certain structures of reality in this way. 4. Our sequential prejudice perception is inherently far more flexible than we recognize, however. There are half steps, other unperceived impulses that leap the nerve ends, too fast and too slow for our usual focus. Recognition of these can be learned and encouraged, bringing in perceptive data that will trigger changes in usual sense response, filling out potential sense spectra with which we are normally not familiar. 5. This greater possible sense spectrum includes increased perception of inner bodily reality in terms of cellular identity and behavior, automatic conscious control of bodily processes, and increased perception of exterior conditions as the usual senses become more vigorous. Our sight, for example, is not nearly as efficient as it could be. Nuances of color, texture, and depth could be expanded, and our entire visual area attain a brilliance presently considered exceptional or supernormal. And now going into comments on the Codicils. Acceptance of these first Codicils would expand practical knowledge of the self, break down barriers that are the result of our prejudiced perception, and restructure personal, social, and political life. Concepts of the self and practical experience of the self must be broadened if the species is to develop its true potentials. Only an evolution of consciousness can alter the world view that appears to our official line of consciousness. Comment on Codicil 2. This next step is as important as the birth of Christianity was in the history of mankind. It will present a new structure for civilization to follow. Christianity represented the human psyche at a certain point, forming first inner patterns for development that then became exteriorized as myth, drama, and history, with the Jewish culture of the Talmud presenting the psyche's direction. The differences between Jewish and Christian tradition represented allied but different probabilities, one splitting off from the other, but united by common roots and actualized in the world to varying degrees. The traditional personified God concept represented the mass psyche's one ego development, the ego ruling the self as God ruled man, man dominant over the planet and other species, as God was dominant over man, as opposed to the idea of many gods or the growth of a more multi-focused self with greater nature identification. Neurological patterning of the kind we know began with the early Old Testament Jews, known then as God's people, looking forward through time to a completely one ego-focused self. Before, neurological functioning was not as set, and in our world today, some minority peoples and tribes still hold to those alternate neurological pulses. These will not appear to our measuring devices because we are literally blind to them. The Jewish prophets, however, utilized these alternate focuses of perception themselves and were relatively unprejudiced neurologically. They were therefore able to perceive alternate visions of reality. Yet their great work, while focusing the energy of an entire religion and leading to Christianity, also resulted in limiting man's potential perceptive area in important ways. The prophets were able to sense the potentials of the mass psyche, and their prophecies charted courses in time, projecting the Jewish religion into the future. The prophecies gave the people great strength precisely because they gave their religion a future in time, providing a thread of continuity and a certain immortality in earthly terms. The prophecies were psychic molds to be filled out in flesh. Some were fulfilled and some were not, but the unfulfilled ones were forgotten and served their purpose by providing alternate selections and directions. The prophecies ahead of time charted out a people's probable course, foreseeing the triumphs and disasters inherent in such an adventure through time. They provided psychic webworks, blueprints, and dramas, with living people stepping into the roles already outlined, but also improvising as they went along. These roles were valid, however, chosen in response to an inner reality that foresaw the shape that the living psyche of the people would take in time. But as a snake throws off old skin, the psyche throws off old patterns that have become rigid, and we need a new set of psychic blueprints to further extend the species into the future, replete with great deeds, heroes, and challenges. a new creative drama projected from the psyche into the three-dimensional arena. For now, we no longer view reality through original eyes, but through structures of belief that we have outgrown. These structures are simply meant to frame and organize experience, but we mistake the picture for the reality that it represents. We've become neurologically frozen in that respect, forced to recognize the one sequential pattern of sense perceptions, so that we think that the one we've chosen is the only one possible. Comments on Codicil 3. Thus far, we've projected the unrecognized portions of our greater selfhood outward into God, religion, government, and exteriorized concepts. In this existence, selfhood is dependent upon sense perceptions, so that our neurological prejudice and rigid focus have limited our concepts of identity. When we do become aware of unofficial information coming through other than recognized channels, then it seems to come from not self or outside. A great deal of energy has been used to repress levels of selfhood and to project these into religious and nationalistic heroes and cultural organizations. Government and religion tried to preserve the status quo, to preserve their own existences, not for political or religious reasons, but to preserve the official picture of the self around which they are formed. But the structured reality in which that kind of self can exist is breaking down. The official picture no longer fits or explains private experience which is growing out of it. There is a momentary rift between the inner psyche and its creations. Besides this, the experienced self is not the same through the ages. The experienced self is a psychic creation, responsive to exterior conditions which it creates as the psyche dives into the waters of experienced earthly selfhood. Only a portion of the potential self is experienced, but different portions as intents and purposes change. It is possible, though, to actualize more of our potential. Comments on Codicils 4 and 5. The answers and solutions lie in using levels of consciousness now considered eccentric or secondary. This includes far greater utilization of the dream states and altered conditions thus far thought to be exceptions of consciousness. These exceptions represent other kinds of focuses, greatly needed to broaden our concepts of the self and our experience of personal selfhood by increasing conceptualization, giving direct experience of alternate views, and bringing other kinds of data to bear upon the world we know. In the past, the attitudes surrounding such perceptions brought about their own difficulties. The perceptions are biologically acceptable, however, and will lead to a clearer relationship between mind and body. Now, before I end this video, you have to know, when she says codicils, you think, no, she means codices. But no, she means codicils. She thought the words meant appendages to a will, which is what codicils means. Yet, in this connotation, they mean appendixes to the will, to man's will. So, I highly suggest you guys read this book. If you've read all of the Seth information, all of the Seth books, this book will be a treasure.